Spore. To be honest, one of my biggest guilty pleasures. Yes, surprising, I know, I like more things than just Sonic the Hedgehog, and that's one of such things. It's a game which has a lot of very interesting mechanics, and it's also very different from other more conventional video games. I really don't think there is any other game that combines so many elements that are so different from each other in a way like Spore does. However, I must admit that despite how interesting the game is, and how much more interesting it gets once you learn about what the game could have been did Electronic Arts not get in the way, there's something that has always caught my attention about Spore, for multiple years, and that's something that I recently thought could make for an interesting video: the questionable politics of Spore. Despite its very fun mechanics, there's something that has always irked me about the game's space stage. Specifically, how the player is rewarded for taking actions which are highly questionable morally. And on top of that, the game never, or almost never, seems to punish the player with any form of repercussion for their actions. This is something that I would like to explore in this video. Spore, its strange space stage politics, contrasting it with modern geopolitics, and finally we'll be able to see where this puts the game politically from the elements we will observe throughout this video. However, before starting to talk about Spore's space stage, I'd like to, for those unfamiliar with Spore or that need a refresher, talk a little bit about the game's core gameplay loop before the space stage. In Spore, you start seeing this gigantic galaxy that serves as a world where your save data planets are located. The first few phases of the game happen within the planet you select, whereas the last, space stage, is an interstellar adventure. So stage happens with the player being, well, a cell. The developers originally described this gameplay style as being in a way a sort of analog version of Pac-Man. The player's species evolves throughout the game, starting as a cell, becoming a creature, evolving into a tribe, into a civilization, and finally becoming a space empire. Honestly, I think it's already really interesting the really Eurocentric mindset that Spore gives us on evolution, being that its framework is based around the idea that civilizations first go through tribal stages and then become civilizations and finally become space empires, giving us a framework that is again pretty Eurocentric. Eurocentric in the sense that it assumes a linear path from primitive tribe to modern empire, a path historically used to justify colonization. However, aside from this paragraph that I'm writing here, I will not focus much on this aspect of Spore's politics in this video. I'm sorry if that's disappointing, but I wanted to make it clear that I did notice that accepting this frame of analysis that the game offers us is very problematic, and I don't accept it. After Cell stage, as I mentioned, there's Creature stage. This stage plays more like an adventure game, with some elements of Simon Says thrown in. Next up, Tribal stage. In this stage, the player controls multiple copies of the character that they finished creating in the previous stage, similar to games like Civ, but a lot less complex. Civilization stage is practically the same as Tribal stage in this regard, a very simplified version of Civ. Speaking of simplifying things, this summary is, already, a pretty simplified summary of Spore, being that the game has a system of choices with which the player has to interact with. These decisions being divided in every stage into three types: a green one, a blue one, or a red one, and each one having an impact on the last stage of the game, space stage, since depending on what colors you got before, the game picks an archetype for you with a specific ability. Now that we're done with this little reminder, we can start talking about what we're really interested in. Spore's space stage is very strange, and I think it could be interesting to discuss. This is mostly due to how, if you analyze it on a surface level, it might seem like it's trying to be a critique of colonialism. However, while I think that that's perhaps what they wanted to with Spore originally in theory, in practice, Spore's space stage ends up feeling like a fascist's wet dream. This is mostly due to the fact that it is an extremely simplified version of modern geopolitics. In Space Stage, you start with your base planet, and once you do a couple of missions, your home planet sends you to put your first colony. The game is framed from an explicit colonialist framework, the only difference being that in most instances, the game recommends you to put colonies on barren planets. Once you put the colony, you fill the planet with plants and animals to bring its terra score levels, that's to say the habitability of the planet, to habitable levels, so your colonies can start exploiting the planet's resources. During Space Stage, you're going to find other species that are in previous stages of the game, Tribal and Civilization Stage respectively. These species never evolved into Space Stage, effectively remaining indigenous from the player's perspective, framing that reflects the Eurocentric assumption that some civilizations are more advanced than others. However, what the game does not tell you about these already inhabited planets but rewards you handsomely for doing, is that going to these planets and killing the existing civilization, essentially committing a genocide of an indigenous population with expansionist and profit incentive goals, will allow the player to put its own colonies. These planets that these indigenous populations inhabit generally have terror score level 3, meaning that doing this will essentially not only allow the player to put 3 colonies on the planet without putting any of their work in to make it inhabitable and exploit the planet's resources, but another point to keep in mind is that some of these planets have pretty rare and valuable resources. These resources being represented in the form of spice, which comes in different colors, and can be sold for different prices to different galactic empires. Taking these actions, which are very clearly the real-world equivalent to doing a genocide with expansionist goals, not unlike what certain countries are doing nowadays, is something that other empires in the game don't do, not even the Groks. On top of that, these planets that the player takes control over never seem to have any issue integrating into your empire. That's to say, it would genuinely seem as if you committed a complete another genocide of the entire native population. This also applying to when the player captures a planet from an empire they're at war with. While I don't think this was the intention of the developers, due to how every single planet in your empire has the player being received by the player's species, and the fact that colonies can only have the same species, it would really seem that once you conquer a planet, your empire just wipes away the previous population, which could be seen as analogous in a way to ethnocracy or ethno-states in the real world. That's to say, states that give privileges to specific races, in quotations, to the expense of all others. This also being analogous to certain historical events throughout the world. The game also has a city planner in which the player can create a layout putting houses, factories, and entertainment centers. However, unlike Civilization stage, in which your citizens could protest if you could only put factories and you had no entertainment centers, well, we'll get to this point later actually. When you play Spore, it's impossible not to develop a sort of strategy that, without exaggerating, sounds like something directly taken out of a book on war by Adolf Hitler. At the start, you want to ally with every empire you find. If they request your help attacking another empire you're allied with, you ignore their request. Attacking them is not in your interests yet. The empires around you will almost always be at war with each other. This will lead to a specific strategic point that you want to take advantage of. Once one of the empires takes control of most of the other empires' planets and they have 1 or 2 left, this is when you strike, take advantage of their vulnerability, break the alliance, and conquer the remaining planets, and you do this with every empire around you. You also want to try to look out for opportunities to try to avoid terraforming planets by yourself as much as possible. This includes colonizing already inhabited planets. This is my save file with the most progress on Spore, its premise being that the species are predator penguins, and it could colonize a lot of planets and get a lot of money with this strategy. The worst part of everything mentioned before is that the game gives the player no sort of repercussion whatsoever for these previously mentioned actions, only for doing stuff that breaks the galactic code. Colonizing already inhabited planets, as we saw, doesn't have any sort of repercussion, not only because it doesn't break the galactic code, but also because other empires are just not going to care. Not even your own citizens care, they submit before your actions. The city planner mentioned previously functions differently in Space Stage, being that the player can fill the city with factories and citizens will never protest. There is an event in the game where your colonies will call you to tell you about this and halt spice production, but the rarity of this event is really high, and logically it should have led to the colonies looking for independence, not just calling you. In general, it doesn't matter how cruel or evil the player is, or how many horrible atrocities they commit with expansionist and monetary goals, your empire will always be on your side, and it will never have any sort of resistance or revolution. The citizens of your empire submit before your decisions as mentioned before, and this applies to citizens of other empires that are being conquered as well. Even the Groks, the caricature of a totalitarian empire, probably inspired by the Nazis, does not do any of the things that the player is so handsomely rewarded for doing, like committing genocide of indigenous people. The only thing the game critiques about the Groks is that they break the galactic code. This obsession that Spore has with rules and the galactic code shows a pretty liberal mindset of the world, in which it doesn't matter that the player commits atrocities, what matters is that they follow the rules doing so, not like real-world opposition to fascism. This is something that can be seen, for example, in the treatment on the topic of immigration in the United States by Democrats, being that liberals only consider dreamers acceptable, that's to say documented immigrants, and consider unacceptable undocumented ones. What matters here not being the fact that these people need another place to live, but rather that they follow the rules. Spore is similar in that the game will allow you to do genocides and conquer other empires as long as you don't break the galactic code, so as long as you don't break any rules, which basically consists of not using specific weapons that the game gives you access to, specifically Gravitation Wave, which breaks all cities in a planet, the Planet Buster, which destroys a planet, or Fanatical Frenzy, which allows a player to conquer a planet from a rival empire immediately. The only reason why the Grogs are hated throughout the universe is not the atrocities that they commit, but only because they break the rules. I hope Spore fans when watching this video don't come out of it thinking that I hate it or anything like that. The truth is, I don't think that because a piece of art is problematic, it cannot be enjoyed. But you get what I mean? Spore's politics are almost fascist, with very strong parallels to modern colonial and ethno-nationalist projects. Expansionist with monetary goals, with very strong parallels to modern colonial and ethno-nationalist projects. I would even say that the actions the player can partake in have many strong parallels with settler colonialism. I can't bring myself to dislike Spore as a game. It's one of the first games I ever played, but it does not mean that as a simplified version of our world, it leaves a lot to be desired. I don't think the developers intended for this to be this way. It's clear to me that the original idea of Spore was so much more deep than this, and that can be easily seen in the preliminary footage for the game.
Now this is our home planet here. We call this the stellar zoo. In fact, we want to have all the real things that you would see in space. One thing that's always really annoyed me about the way astronomy is presented is it's presented as two-dimensional. If you look at star maps like that, I mean, that's the way astronomy is taught. But yet it's this beautifully three-dimensional thing, and you just are not given the sense of what that's like. We have these beautiful images from Hubble, and we're never given any context for how big they are, where they live, how frequent we see them in space. And I really wanted to, at this level, give a player a real sense of what it feels like to be out in the galaxy. So we have things like black holes back here. We have planetary nebula, and this is basically an old supernova shell. These very bright stars are like blue giants, and in fact are going to go supernova fairly soon, so I have to kind of stay away from those. So there's actually a terrain here to this. This is the Mission Nebula back here, where new stars are formed.
However, the game had a troubling development because of EA, and it came out as simplistic as it did. Due to this, I cannot avoid the truth that the questionable politics of Spore are pretty much fascist politics. So yeah, Spore is still one of my guilty pleasures, but I can't keep pretending that its politics aren't deeply messed up. Thanks for watching.